Pivot tables are powerful data analysis tools, and working knowledge of them enhances Excel functionality tremendously. As the name suggests, a pivot table allows us to reorganize our data and look at it from different angles. Pivot tables are essentially separate tables that are generated from source data. We can use pivot tables to calculate, summarize, and analyze our data, which helps us to draw comparisons and see trends. Excel worksheets can be very large with many rows and columns of data. Pivot tables make data analysis much more manageable, especially when working with large data sets. Let's learn how they work using this spreadsheet. This worksheet contains data for some of Food2Go's partner restaurants with multiple branches in different areas. We have information on cuisine, delivery area, orders and sales figures for June and July, as well as customer ratings and complaints numbers. That's a lot of data to look through, and if we are looking for something in particular or want to answer specific questions, we can generate a pivot table to help us. Let's create a pivot table to find out the total sales for each restaurant in June. Now, because each restaurant has multiple branches, we would have to add up the sales figures across all branches. A pivot table helps us to automate this analysis and do it almost instantly. But before you create a pivot table, you must ensure a few things. Your data must be arranged in a table format with rows and columns. It must not contain any blank rows or columns and should have a single row of headers. It's also good to ensure that your data range is formatted as an Excel table. If your data source is an Excel table, then rows or columns added to the table are automatically included in the pivot table when you refresh it. To create a pivot table, you have to select your data range, or if your data is formatted as a table like this, just click anywhere inside it and go to the Insert ribbon. Now you will see two pivot table commands. If we use the Recommend Pivot Tables option, Excel will generate a pivot table from the data on your worksheet and try to guess how you want the report arranged. We will click on the Pivot Table command instead and build our own pivot table. Now in this dialog box, your table or range will already be inserted and you just have to choose where you want your pivot table to be placed. Usually pivot tables are placed on a new worksheet, so we have to make sure this is selected. This way, we will have plenty of space to work with. When you click OK, you will be taken to a new worksheet that looks like this. The box on the left is where your pivot table report will appear. It's currently empty, and we have to build it using the Pivot Table Builder on the right. These pivot table fields have been pulled from our column headers in our source data, and we can use the checkboxes to control what is included in our pivot table report according to the question we want to answer. Now, the important thing to understand is that these fields are not just our column headers, but contain all the values within those columns. So if we go back to our table worksheet, the area field will contain all of these values in the area column. Just keep this in mind while you are building your pivot table. Now, underneath the fields, you will see 4 quadrants. To build a pivot table, at least 2 of these quadrants must contain fields. A field must be inserted into the Values quadrant, and the second field can be in either the Rows or Columns quadrant. So, let's say we want to find out the total sales for June for each restaurant across all areas. Which fields will we need to use? We will need the Restaurant field, of course, and then the Sales field for June. Now, the reason we don't need the area field to answer this question is because we are not looking for a breakdown of sales by area. Given these fields, we have to decide which quadrant they fit into, depending on how we want our report arranged. Our table will have both columns and row headers. Our restaurants will be our row headers, and June sales will be our column header. When you have decided where a field belongs, just click on it and drag it to the correct area. If we drag restaurants to the rows quadrant, you will see that a pivot table has started to populate on the left. Excel has taken all the unique values from the restaurant column in our source data and inserted them as row headers. Now we want to see the June sales figure for each restaurant, so we need to drag the sales June field to the values quadrant. As you drag, pay attention to the way the pivot table populates. Now, if you're not sure which quadrant a field belongs in, you can always experiment by trying different quadrants out. Let's say we put the sales field in the column quadrant instead. This is what would happen. All the unique values in our sales column for June have been listed as column headers. If we now drag it back to the values column, the pivot table automatically reorganizes itself. And there we have our first pivot table. We can clearly see the total sales for June for each restaurant, and Excel has done all the hard work for us so quickly. Pivot tables also automatically add a grand total row, which in our example gives us the total sales for June for all restaurants. Now you may notice that the format of the sales columns has changed. The values are missing the dollar signs that were there in our source data. The good thing is that there is a quick fix for this. Just right-click on any of the values and then select Number Format. From this menu, we can go ahead and select Currency, and let's remove these decimal places and click OK. Now our pivot table has not only formatted the cell we selected, but has changed all of the cells in the same field. This is unique to pivot tables. Alright, since we have a pivot table, we can now use it to answer different questions simply by adding or reorganizing our fields in the 4 quadrants. Suppose we want to know how these restaurants performed by area. Now our area values can be either row or column headers. Let's try them both out. First, let's drag area to the row quadrant. We can see that the areas have now been listed as rows under each restaurant, and it's easy to see how individual restaurants have performed by area. Now each restaurant row contains our total sales figures for June for all areas. We can just double check this for Basil and Lime by highlighting the sales values for all areas and then checking the sum in the status bar. And the figure matches with the sum of sales for June. You will also see an arrow added in each restaurant cell. You can click on these arrows to show or hide the area rows if you need to, and this is really convenient. Now, what would our report look like if we had dragged area to the column quadrant instead? Let's check. With this report, we can answer even more detailed questions, like how did June sales for Basil and Lime in the north area compare to the east? We can also compare restaurant performance across a single area by looking at the values in one column. Pivot tables also makes it easier to notice trends. Overall, it seems like the north region for all restaurants has the highest sales compared to other areas, and the east has the lowest sales. We can also spot anomalies relatively quickly. Now, this table configuration has 2 grand total fields. The grand total column gives us the total sales for each restaurant across all areas, while the grand total row gives us the total sales in each area. When building pivot tables, we can add multiple fields to the same quadrant. Let's drag cuisine to the row quadrant and see what happens. Alright, so our report just adds a row under each restaurant to tell us the cuisine. Now the values in this row are identical to the restaurant values because the sales figures do not change. Now when you have multiple fields in one quadrant, the cool thing is that you can reorganize your pivot table by changing the order of fields. Check out what happens when you drag cuisine above restaurant. Now our restaurants have been grouped by cuisine. We immediately know that our data contains 5 cuisines and most of the restaurants are Indian. This configuration would help us compare sales of restaurants of the same cuisine, which can be very useful information. Now we can also see the total sales for each cuisine in the grand total column, but you may realize that this won't be a fair comparison because each cuisine has a different number of restaurants. It wouldn't exactly be fair to compare the total sales for the 5 Indian restaurants with Thai, which has only 1 restaurant. The great news is we can specify our value fields further to tell Excel what to calculate. To do this, go to the value quadrant and click on the arrow next to sales. From the menu, click on Value Field Settings. Now by default, the function used for values is the sum function, but we can change this over here. There are lots of options, but some of them will be more useful than others depending on your data. If we choose average and click OK, our report now shows us the average sales for each cuisine and restaurant by area. This is more useful because if we look at the north column, Mexican restaurants have the highest average sales, and this is close to double the average sales for the same restaurants in the east. From the grand total column, we can see that Mexican restaurants have the highest average sales for June. Chinese, Indian, and Italian are very close, while Thai has the lowest sales. Now we've pretty much covered all the basics of pivot tables, but it's also important to know how to remove fields. Let's say we want to remove the restaurant field. All we have to do is just untick the box next to the restaurant field, and we will be left with a really neat and clear pivot table report showing average sales by area for each cuisine. As we have seen, pivot tables are very versatile, and this is just the beginning.